Hi, I'm Jonathan Weinberg, and this is Drawing with Fountain Pens. I'm in New Haven today. It's Martin Luther King Day. It was snowy yesterday, and I just got back from Philly on late on Saturday. This is the little guide, nibbage guide that they give you at the Philadelphia Pen Show, and I was there on Friday, January 17th, and Saturday, January 18th. And I had a terrific time. I really like the Philadelphia Pen Show because it's in downtown Philadelphia. Most of the urban pen shows, even though they might say, for example, Boston is in Somerville, which you can get to pretty easily with public transportation, but it's a small pen show. But in Baltimore and Washington, the pen shows are in the suburbs, so you really have to drive to get there. I'm sure you can take public transportation, but it's not so easy. In Philadelphia, I can take the train from New Haven, and I can walk from the station in Philadelphia right to the hotel, which is the Sheraton. And I really like that. I like walking, and I grew up in New York City, and so I really appreciate that. And Philadelphia is a great city. It's great museums and restaurants, and the hotel is pretty nice. And at that time of the year, because it's winter, cold, it's not a very expensive time to go. So a room at the Sheraton wasn't so hugely expensive, and that's another an advantage of having it there. It's not the biggest pen show, though. Baltimore and Washington. Baltimore is bigger. Washington is the biggest as far as I know, in the world, or at least it's sort of sold as that. I haven't been to other pen shows in the rest of the country, but I think sometimes they're bigger. But nevertheless, it's big enough to have a lot of the usual suspects, particularly in the vintage pen world. Paul Arano and Mad Mercantile and David Eichsson and the Pelikan desk, and Pilot was there. I was happy to see Adolphus Smith of DeReal Pens, and there were several other pen makers like Heinz, but not as many as you see in Baltimore and D.C. There wasn't Jonathan Brooks or Sean Newton. Scott Jones was there showing off his latest drawings. He does a drawing every day, and he uses pens that are from the early part of the 20th century that have wonderful flex nibs, and he's an incredible expert on pens, and he collects these drawings into beautiful books, and he sort of sits at this table right next to Mad Mercantile, Mike Magley, I guess is how you pronounce it. Anyway, Mike has he's a pen dealer, and this is usually a place where a lot of people congregate who are part of the pen community. So if you're new to pens and Scott loves to talk to people, and you sit there with him and talk to him and hopefully buy one of his books. You don't have to buy one of his books, but look through it, and that's a great place to meet people in the pen community when you're at one of these shows. I arrived on Friday. Friday is much less crowded than Saturday and Sunday, and I strongly recommend when you go to a pen show to go on that day, because you don't have to worry about the crowds, and it's really easy to meet with people, and people are fresh and they're just setting up, and it's just very nice on Friday. You can get a 3-day pass, and this tends to be true at the other pen shows, that lets you in early on Saturday and Sunday, an hour early, but then that's the time when the dealers are setting up, so they can be a bit distracted. But anyway, I do recommend that, at least if you don't come on Friday, that you can get in there when it's not so crazy. And a lot of the big pen companies were there, Pilot and Pelikan and Kenway Industries that owns Esterbrook, and Narwhal that owns Omas. There were, of course, some of those smaller companies. Sean Design, which is located, I believe, in Philadelphia, they had a big table, and they were showing off another version of their Monarch nib that I got to try briefly. And there was also Franklin Christoph, but no Karas pens. And so some of the I think there were probably some of the middle level pen companies maybe weren't there. There were several of the small companies, usually one-man operation or one-person operations, I should say, where you have someone who makes their own pens. For example, Alfonso Smith of Derail Pens. I've bought two pens from him in the past, and I will continue to buy pens from him. He had a Table and Heinz Company, but there weren't people like Sean Newton and Jonathan Brooks don't come to the Philadelphia show. So I like the size of the Philadelphia show. I feel like it's just the right size. It's not too big and crazy like the DC show, but it's not so small and just vintage pen dealers, or mostly vintage pen dealers like the show in Boston or Somerville. There were many nibsmiths. My friend Josh Lax was there, All in the Nib, Damien of All in the Nib, but many nibsmiths. So pen shows are a great time to go. You should schedule your appointment, but it's a great way to go to the show and have one of your pens or several of your pens tuned with a nibsmith right there, so that you can sort of figure out exactly how you want the pen to work and test it out. Much better than sending your pen in the mail to someone to fix the pen. Now, I'm not going to go this time. I did this last year. I went sort of around and spoke to people and interviewed some people. I'm not going to do that. Mike Matheson of Ink Dependence does a great job of doing that. He tours the entire show, streams it live, and speaks to everyone. I recommend his channel for that. Rather, I'm going to sort of just talk about my personal experience. I was only there Friday and Saturday, so I wasn't there on Sunday. And even though I bought a lot of cash, I didn't buy a lot of pens. I mean, I only actually bought one pen. I guess I should feel good about that. I tend now, I think, as I are becoming more discerning and more used to these shows, I tend to sort of look at the show as an opportunity to try out pens. If I see something really amazing, I'm gonna buy it. But then I come home and I think about it, and in some cases, I've actually then contacted the dealer and bought a pen after the fact. But it's a great time, particularly, to try things out. And if you're not someone who collects vintage pens, but wants to buy contemporary pens, it really is great, because you have dealers like Pilot, or companies like Pilot, that put out all their pens. Pilot doesn't sell their pens at the shows at all. They're just there to display what they're doing. New pens, really, really expensive pens, and you don't have to feel at all any obligation to buy anything, because they're not actually selling anything. And I think that is great. In general, that's something you have to sort of get over, is sort of the idea that, well, if you talk to somebody and you look at their pens, you have to buy something. Because people at the shows really want to talk to you. They really enjoy showing you what they're doing. A lot of the people there who are dealers, this is sort of their second job. They're not living off the pens. So don't worry so much about the idea that you have to buy something. Everybody wants to really sort of talk about pens and show off what they have. And when you come to a pen show, too, bring some of your favorite pens, because you get an opportunity probably to show them off. All the great things about this hobby, I don't even like calling it a hobby, this obsession, is that every fountain pen, no matter how lowly, kind of writes differently, a little differently. And the more you use the pen, the more it's going to write differently, because the way in which you hold it is going to have some effect. So it's fun to try out different pens. And even if I have a pen, let's say I have a Pilot pen, or my Pelikan, my favorite Pelikan M800. I'm not going to have it in every nib size, so it's interesting to try out a extra fine, even though I have a broad, or it might be interesting to try out the difference between a Pelikan 800 that is new and one that is from the 90s. So it's great to bring a pen with you when you go and share that with. It's a great way to make connections. Now, right in the beginning of the show, I made a discovery that I found very shocking and exciting, which is I went to speak to Gary Lang at the Pelikan table. Now, in the past, I haven't seen Pelikan at these shows, so it was nice to see him, and we talked about pens. I love Pelikan's pen line. And right in the beginning, he told me something that surprised me. Well, first say who you are.
Gary with Pelikan. Hello.
Okay. And you say Pelikan. You don't say Pelikan.
You know what? Even in Germany, they more typically say Pelikan than Pelikan.
Really?
But if you see like the commercials that they have, these retro commercials from the 1960s, they really emphasize Pelikan.
Okay.
They really emphasize it. But I think people have just gotten faster at saying it, and so Pelikan has turned into Pelikan. But
so it's like Van Gogh and Van Gogh.
Yeah, Van
Nobody.
Gogh, yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So it's less pretentious if you say Pelikan.
Exactly.
Oh, that's interesting. Another big important meeting for me was on the second day of the show. I was actually looking at the pens at Mad Mercantile, and there was a nice man there, and suddenly we talked. This turned out to be Pier Gustafson, who has a YouTube channel and is a kind of legendary pen dealer and artist, someone that my friend Todd Merrill, who also is a great sort of pen maven, talks about Pier and how terrific he is and interesting. People know him, I think, also, if you watch a lot of YouTube reviews, for his particular test, which is that instead of just writing out the words of, the boring words about your dog, right, and the fox, he scribbles and really tests how a pen would work if you're drawing fast, right, rather than writing out some boring phrase. And that's something actually that I realized that I should be doing rather than just writing out words when I review pens. But this has become known as the Pier test because of his association with that. And I think that's kind of funny. I immediately knew that he was a sort of kindred spirit when we were talking, and somehow the artist Ivan Albright came up. He's an artist from around World War II, between the wars, and an American painter, probably best known because he did the actual portrait in the Hollywood movie Picture of Dorian Gray. I thought it was kind of funny thing. He does this sort of very surrealist, kind of grotesque pictures, but not a lot of people know about his work. And so I thought, oh my goodness, he knows that, and he knows about the movies. And we just had so many things to talk about in common, and artists that we liked or didn't like. And he also is a member of a Boston urban sketch group, and we hung out for a while, and he showed me a bunch of his pens, and I hope that we are going to become good friends. I certainly immediately started watching his channel, which I strongly recommend. There's actually some really good information about what you should do at a pen show if you're an artist, and what kind of pens that you should buy. So he's a born teacher, and really, really strongly recommend it. At 5 p.m. on the first day of my Philly experience, I went to a seminar called Stitch a Nib Wipe, which was hosted by Aziza Askarali, who of course runs Gourmet Pens, which is a terrific website and shop, and she has terrific YouTube videos, and is one of the pen celebrities, right? And the title of the workshop was a bit of a misnomer because you didn't really stitch. There was no sewing involved, which wasn't a big problem for me. Actually, if you look at the thing that was created with us or for us, you see that it's actually put together with what's called a grommet. And it was kind of odd thing. Also, she didn't actually teach it so much as present it. Wendell Sue Grover from Fountain Pens News was more of the teacher, and there was another friend who kind of ran the workshop, and it was more that we learned how to make these peculiar nib wipes. You see it here. The way it worked is there was, I don't know how many people came, but maybe there were 4 tables, maybe it was 20, 30 people, and we broke up into these tables, and then they would call us up, and then you got to choose this material, which is basically for cleaning eyeglasses, and you got to choose what charms you wanted. I chose fountain pen connected charms. This is I don't know if you can see this, but it's a fountain pen nib charm, and then there's sort of this ink bottle charm. And they put this together for us, and you kind of learned the method for how to do this. Like you could do this yourself if you need the only thing you really need besides the actual materials is you would need a kind of machine or it's a kind of tool that helps you put the grommet in, and you could make more of these sort of nib wipes. I mean, to be honest, all you really need is to use the concept of using an eyeglass cleaner and as a nib wipe. You don't need the rest of this, but it kind of created a souvenir. And the other nice thing is that as you waited to come up to the table, it's almost like in the wedding. You sat with some new people and you got to talk to them, and everybody was showing each other their pens and talking about their experience, what they were learning and why they were there. And so it was a very nice little social occasion, and it reminded me again about how nice people are in the pen community and how accessible it is. Like the most well-known pen persons you can meet at these fountain pen things. There's no sense that, that this is a distant thing. I mean, a good example would be that, let's say you went to one of the big art fairs in Miami or in Switzerland. You're not going to be hobnobbing probably with the biggest gallerists. They're not going to give you time because you don't have millions of dollars to buy a Van Gogh painting. But at a pen meetup, you are going to probably, if you want to, you're going to be able to talk to the person who is the main head of the distribution of Pelikan, or a similar person who does that for Pilot, or one of the best known persons who talks on YouTube about fountain pens. So it's a very small community from that standpoint. At 6 o'clock, I went to a panel that was organized by Josh Lax, who is a nibsmith and a great person to go to at the fountain pen show when you want to have your pen tuned. That's another great reason to go to a fountain pen show, because you get an opportunity. You have to sort of make an appointment, usually ahead of time on the web. But even then, when you go to the show, there often are spaces open, and you can bring your pen and have it tuned and pay something. And it's much better to do that in person, because then you can test it out right there and tell the nibsmiths what you want, how you want it to write. Anyway, Josh is not just somebody who is a great nibsmith, but he's somebody who kind of bridges the divide between a lot of different kinds of collectors and people who are interested in pens. And he has done this before, but he organized a panel made up of people who are a lot of dealers, but experts, but also artists. on the panel to talk about the whole question of how do you find a good pen at a pen show. And it was really geared for people who are new to pen shows, but even for somebody like me who's been to several and have been doing this for a while, it has some useful information. I've been to and talked about earlier versions of this panel. So there were people like Scott Jones and Paul Arano, who's the editor of the Fountain Pen Journal that I write with, and David Isaacson and Mick Magley of Mad Mercantile, and they talked about, mostly, the extraordinary quality of pens made before World War II, and how you can get a good pen if you go to a fountain pen show. Early on, there was a debate that I've heard before about how do you know that a pen is vintage versus older. What does the word vintage mean? That was a question that Josh brought up. I think it was David who said that there is a kind of cutoff between that happens in the 1950s when the cartridge fountain pen is invented, or we should say is sort of popularized, because actually they had cartridge pens at the turn of the century. This is one of those Schaefer cartridge pens or student pens. These are the kind of pens actually that I collect. And he talked about how you can sort of that how this is the point in which fountain pens transition. The cartridge pen was developed to compete with the ballpoint pen, and yet other people said, well, how can a pen that is well over 60 years not be considered vintage? The word vintage really just is a word for old, but not as old as an antique. An antique usually means 100 years or more. And so eventually these will be 100 years old. So the term vintage doesn't really have one meaning. It changes in context, right? And a lot of people like me collect pens from the 90s, like Rotring, and pens that are made in the 70s. Not necessarily because they're the best made pens, but because they were the pens that I used when I was young in high school. So collectors have all kinds of reasons to buy pens, and that's something to keep in mind. And Josh, I think, is particularly good about sort of recognizing that more contemporary pens can really be things that can be wonderful to collect. One of the interesting things is that at a lot of these dealers, even at the show, for example, Paul Arano had some bags of later Schaefer pens, and you can get pretty good deals on them. They're very inexpensive because they're not as desirable. The whole mania for fountain pens has particularly meant that pens that flex, like Waterman pens, have become really, really expensive. 20 years ago, people who were getting into this business could buy bags and bags and bags of pens and restore them, and then make quite a lot of profit. It's getting much harder to do that because people are hyper aware that fountain pens now are valuable, and people are collecting them all over the country and the world. It's harder to find good deals at flea markets, but you still can. And actually, Pierre was telling me of some and showing me some of the pens that he picked up at the show. The one pen that I did buy was the Sears pen that was made by Schaefer. I got it at Mad Mercantile. And it is very similar to the student pen, but it is custom made for Sears, and I really like the idea of having that. I'm very interested in the genesis of these pens, and so that's the reason why I would buy it, not because I particularly think that this pen is going to write so well. I'm going to be doing in the next few weeks a video returning to the subject of the student pen, and I wanted to have examples of these very early examples of these cartridge pens. So that's a different kind of collecting than collecting, the best pen or the pen that draws the best. Those are different reasons to collect fountain pens. In any case, that was the kind of things that were being talked about. The best part of the workshop, which was free, was when the different people on the panel brought out some of their pens, and they went out into the audience and showed us the different pens that they have and it took questions, and people were allowed to try them out, and that was lots of fun to be able to do that, to really put your hands on pens. And that's that on so many levels is what the fountain pen shows are about. So if you're somebody who's collecting new pens, the pens are really, really expensive, and the fountain pen shows is a great time to go around and try out some new models and to try out some expensive pens. You always want to ask first if you're allowed to pick up a pen and try it out. You want to be sure that you know whether a pen unscrews or it's a type of pen that you can pull the cap out. You may want to talk to the person behind the table. But keep in mind, and this is a thing that I initially had problems with, is that, nobody necessarily expects you to buy a pen. People there really want to talk to you and show off the pens that they have. This is something that pen people love to do. They actually love talking to new people. There's an idea in Buddhism that actually coming to practice with a beginner's mind is a wonderful thing, meaning somebody who doesn't have any prejudices, who's kind of open to it. I think it's so wonderful because, to sustain one's enthusiasm for fountain pens, teaching and showing people the pens actually is part of all of that, right? It's not just something you do for yourself, but something that you share with other people, and it makes it in a way more interesting and exciting if you can kind of sort of share the love. And I think that's part of the whole story. So when you're a newbie, you're actually helping the oldies in their passion. You're keeping that passion alive. So I think that's another thing to think about, rather than be so obsessed with the idea, oh my God, you have to buy something and you don't want to mislead somebody. It's really a kind of wonderful kind of sharing process. So the next day, on Saturday, I went out. I got up, pretty early, but the pen show doesn't start till 10 o'clock. I was there right at 10 o'clock. If you have that weekend pass, you can get in early. But this time, since I was only there on Friday and Saturday, I waited till 10. It was, as one expected, almost immediately started to get very crowded, which is a great thing because you want the pen show to be a success, but it makes it a bit harder to talk to people. But to my surprise, that's when I met Pier, and then we got into a big discussion about fountain pens, and he showed me a lot of his pens, and that was just great. In the afternoon, I did a workshop on how to write Spencerian handwriting. If you watch my YouTube videos, you know that I keep saying I'm not any good at calligraphy. I hate my handwriting, although I guess it's improved somewhat. And I'm fascinated by other people who are able to do wonderful handwriting and wish that I could do it. So I thought it was really interesting. This was taught by Mike Ward, who's a dancer and an extraordinary calligrapher. He's someone, I think, who thinks about how to do fountain pen handwriting, or to do ornamental calligraphic handwriting, which often is done, by the way, with a dip pen as well as a fountain pen. I think he thinks about it almost like dancing, and the different parts, like you learn different kinds of steps and formations and positions, and then you put them all together. And over a 3-hour period, in a very exhaustive an intensive workshop. He went over the entire alphabet and how you form the different letters. Nobody could possibly learn how to do Spencerian handwriting, which is actually quite difficult, in 3 hours. This really was an introduction to the method, and allows you to kind of think about whether you want to go and teach yourself how to do this or take other workshops and learn how to do it, and the amount of commitment and time that you would need to do that. He's a very lively teacher, so it was very interesting for me. I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to pursue this, since I make my own art and drawing and prints and curating. I'm not sure if I have the time to do it, but at least now I know what is really involved in that practice. I think one of the great things about these shows is that it's not about like networking. It's not about like, oh, how can you come to the show and get a job, or make a lot of money, or meet the most important person. For me, it's really kind of surprising, because you meet all kinds of different people, and it really is a community. I also think it's a kind of wonderful learning experience. I'm not somebody who I think overly identifies with my pens and sees them like people, but there are lots of people at the pen show who do have those kinds of connections. The way, for example, a musician might connect to their guitar or their violin. I have hundreds of brushes that I paint with, and I don't particularly, for example, have one brush that I love more than all my other brushes and go to, because that's the brush that I have to use when I paint with. But a lot of other artists do have that kind of connection. I'm more like, well, what am I trying to convey in my painting, or what am I trying to get across in my drawing? And I might use many different tools to do that, and enjoy those tools very much and be fascinated by them. I want to know sort of how they mean, how they can create meaning, and also how they had meaning in history as designs. I want to know something too about the writers who use them and the artists that use them. To me, they all evoke those things as objects on many different levels. I don't personally get so, I think, worked up with the individual pens, but there are people at the shows who do have that kind of enthusiasm, and I find that infectious, and I can learn from it, and it enhances my sense of fountain pen history, and also of the history of the culture, right, and how they connect to that. So it's worth it. The next fountain pen show that I'm going to go to, I'm pretty sure, is going to be in Baltimore, which is bigger, has a lot more of the makers, the small makers who make pens. So I think it's kind of terrific. It's also going to be warmer, and it's even not that far from Washington, D.C. and from the museums in Baltimore. So if there are shows going on, we might see some of that too. It's a shame to come to Philadelphia and only go to a fountain pen show. So next year, if you go to Philly, try to make some time and go to the Philadelphia Museum and or the Barnes Collection. As always, if this is at all useful for you, please subscribe and press the like button. Let me know what your experience was like at the Philly show, and I hope to see you in Baltimore.